Hi, and welcome to another episode at Lattice Training. Today, we're going to be sort of following me on what I've been doing over the past 4 weeks with a finger that I tweaked. So how I've gradually eased back into climbing. I get asked a lot about this because I think finger tweaks and little niggles are a tricky thing to navigate because they aren't an injury that you feel like you need to go to the physio for and do a rehab plan, but you also can't continue with your normal training. So I guess the first thing to think about is, what am I talking about when I say I tweaked my finger? And I guess for me, this slightly comes down to my experience in climbing and having had finger injuries before. So I know that I can place this on a sort of spectrum of severity for me. And when I think about a finger tweak, I think about I still have good range of motion, but I can bring about a bit of discomfort when I push into a half crimp on the palm of my hand. I also have to press quite hard to bring about any pain with pressure in this way. So I feel pretty confident not needing to seek physio advice, but I do want to change up my training to allow it to recover and to not, make it just drag on and become chronic, because let's face it, we don't want to miss too much of our climbing and training. So week 1 after tweaking my finger, so I felt this when I cooled down from my session, and you wake up the next morning and often you're like, oh yeah, I've definitely done something there. And I do think that the first step with any tweak, even if you don't think it's that severe, is to actually just have a rest week. This doesn't mean doing nothing, but I think personally for me in the long run, I think it is a better approach because, I don't know, definitely me, I think it's a bit like, give me an inch and I'll take a mile. So if I was like, I'll just have an easy climb, I probably would push myself a bit too hard and overdo it. And really, the loss of climbing and training within that week is not going to make that big a difference. So I took about 5 days rest, complete rest in a row for my finger, and just did some conditioning. This is great because you could get to work on all those weaknesses that you often neglect when we can actually climb, and they're also really important for finger health. Like, I think if you keep your body nice and strong, you can actually distribute weight when you go back to climbing a little bit more evenly throughout your body, and take some of that load off your fingers. So in week 1, alongside the conditioning, I used the pinch block and the edge of this to keep up some of my finger training, as well as to do some really light hangs on my injured hand. So the reason I like the pinch block is because it's really easy to keep a higher load on my uninjured hand and then switch it to a lower load for my injured hand. And I think I quite often get asked, like, is this okay to do different loads for different hands? So you wouldn't want to do this for a really extended period of time and maybe open up a strength gap between your two sides. But when it comes to tweaks, we're often thinking about maybe 4 weeks of adjusted training, and then I'm going to build back into my normal training. So I'm not too worried about doing that here. So alongside doing a 4-finger half crimp on my uninjured side, a light half crimp on my injured side, I also sort of think this can be a good opportunity to work some more difficult grips, and a pinch block can be a really nice way to start doing that because it's really easy to adjust the load on here, even if you can't hang the grip in a body weight position on a fingerboard, which when it comes to things like back 3, I can't. So I think you can attach quite a light weight to this, and because this is sort of temporary adjusted training, I try to use sessions where I don't need to worry too much about load or testing. This is just to tide me over. So I actually just stick to a relatively low load and a session layout of 10 seconds on, so loading, and then 50 seconds rest, and then 10 seconds on in these back 3 positions. And I'll do that for 8 in each position. And it's just like a really easy session to get into. You don't have to warm up your fingers too much because you're not doing that heavier load, but it also just helps you maintain that strength that you've built in your fingerboarding up until that point where you might have tweaked a finger. So it's week 2 now after I tweaked my finger, and I've done a really good warm up, and I'm gonna have a climb and I'm gonna see how it feels. So I've started off the week in a really controlled way, building back up onto the fingerboard. So after a week of working on the pinch block, before I climb, I want to see that I can hang body weight on the fingerboard in that half crimp position. Even though I'm only actually going to climb on jugs when I'm actually on the board, that for me is like a really good sign, and also just makes me more confident going back to my climbing. So I've done a whole session of body weight fingerboarding, and the next day and after the session, my finger felt fine. It felt just the same, and so I think that's a really nice sign to me that I can get on the board on some bigger holds and have a climb. So I don't want to be like loading my finger in any like weird ways, so I'm going to really focus on keeping my feet on and maintaining tension throughout all the movements. And that's quite a nice focus to bring to a session when I can't try my absolute hardest and go all out on the hold types. So a nice progression of the pinch block training that I did for a week, working on the back 3 to sort of mitigate my tweaked index, is that now that I'm doing my bodyweight fingerboarding back on the fingerboard, I am still doing my back 3, but because I can't do body weight for my back 3, I just keep my feet on the floor and then I just pull down into the fingerboard. And for this sort of short period where you're looking to just like adjust a few sessions to tide you over, I think this is a really nice way to get around any testing or setting up any pulley to take off the weight. Okay, so it's the start of week 3 now. So last week I did bodyweight fingerboarding and some more mileage sessions on the board, just focusing on nice big holds, and my finger responded really well to that. So this week I'm going to try and push it a little bit harder. I'm still going to stick to like quite open hand holds and hand holds that aren't too challenging, but I'm going to try and make some slightly harder moves and maybe start cutting my feet a little bit and loading my finger in that way. It's basically really good when you're trying to make hard, juggy boulder problems to find all the jugs that don't face the right way. That's the main key. Lots of like Gastons and undercuts. It's really good for like burly climbing. Okay, so I'm heading into week 4 now, and I've gradually progressed things on the board a little bit to some slightly harder sort of problems with big holds. And now in week 4, I have continued with my bodyweight fingerboarding, but I am going to try and push my climbing a little bit more. And the reason I'm doing this is because bodyweight fingerboarding for me is actually relatively good. I think at my very max, before I tweaked my finger, I was at about maybe plus 18 to 20. And so I want to keep the fingerboarding the same to see how my finger responds to adding a few smaller holds in on the board. So I think this is something that a lot of people maybe make a little mistake on with tweaks, is that they week on week, they push maybe everything at once. So I'm feeling really comfortable on the fingerboard, and I'm going to try and introduce some of that into my climbing. And then I will go for a rest week in week 5, and then I'll start to push my fingerboarding weights a little bit and keep the climbing the same. And then from there on, hopefully I'll be able to climb as I wish and enjoy myself. So now that I'm in week 5, I'm actually going to take a bit of a deload from my climbing. I built it up back to using crimps on some basic problems on the board, and monitored how my finger felt afterwards, and it felt fine. So I'm going to use my deload week to back off from the climbing a little bit, but start to add some weight for my fingerboarding so that I can just stagger those different sort of progressions back into my training. And if my finger responds well to these, I'll combine them in my next training cycle where I can be getting back to my normal climbing.